How do you study culture? While scientists have experimentation, historians have books. Reading widely, thinking deeply, and drawing insights from decades of study. But what if culture could be measured? What if we could track the evolution of ideas with the same precision that physicists track the motion of planets? In 2007, the opportunity emerged. Google had quietly scanned 30 million books from libraries worldwide, 5 centuries of human thought compressed onto hard drives, and 2 graduate students persuaded the company to transform this library into something new, a dataset tracking words and phrases year by year. A telescope for culture. Part 1. Word fossils. In 2005, Erez Lieberman and Jean-Baptiste Michel found themselves stuck on a question that any child might ask. Why do we say drove and not drived? They were graduate students at Harvard's program for evolutionary dynamics, an unusual place where mathematicians worked alongside linguists, where cancer researchers talked to physicists, all trying to understand how complex systems change over time. This particular problem, why some English verbs followed the regular pattern while others clung stubbornly to irregular forms, felt like it might reveal something fundamental about how culture evolves. The irregular verbs were linguistic fossils. Words like drove, knew, and went were survivors of an ancient grammatical system that had been dying for millennia. 10,000 years ago, Proto-Indo-European, ancestor to English, German, Greek, Hindi, and hundreds of other languages, changed verb tenses by shifting vowels. Sing, sang, sung, ring, rang, rung. Several thousand years later, around 500 BCE, speakers of Proto-Germanic in Scandinavia invented a simpler alternative for verbs that didn't fit, add ed. The new rule spread rapidly. Over centuries, it conquered verb after verb. A millennium ago, you hope someone. Now, you help them. Thrive held out until the 1920s, when newspapers finally stopped writing about gambling halls that throve. But some verbs held on. Drive kept drove. Go kept went. About 300 irregulars survived into modern English. Why these particular survivors? Linguists already had a theory. They reasoned that frequent irregular verbs would be harder to forget and easier to remember correctly. A child hears went hundreds of times, but throve only once or twice. Over generations, this process would act like natural selection. Common irregulars would survive, while rare ones would die out. It was an elegant hypothesis. Frequency was fitness. But could they prove it? To test the theory, they needed data. They needed to track irregular verbs across centuries to see if rare ones really did disappear faster than common ones. Ideally, they would read every book ever published in English, but they were graduate students, planning to graduate within 4 years, not 4 lifetimes. They improvised. They recruited 2 undergraduates who spent months in the library, reading historical grammar textbooks. These books discussed irregular verbs, mentioned many of them, and often provided partial lists. By systematically working through the grammar of Old and Middle English, they compiled a list of 177 Old English irregular verbs. They could track each one for more than 1,000 years. The pattern was unmistakable. The common verbs, go, know, drive, had held their ground for centuries. The rare ones, such as thrive and weave, had quietly vanished, replaced by regular forms. Frequency was the difference between survival and extinction. Natural selection was shaping language itself. And they discovered something even more remarkable. Verbs disappeared at predictable rates. The math was so precise, they could forecast which verbs would die next, and when. The verb wed would likely abandon its irregular form, wed instead of wedded, within centuries. But drive, being so frequent, would keep drove for a longer 7,800 years. They could predict the future of language, but they had done it the hard way. Months of meticulous work to study just 177 verbs out of thousands. What about all the other words in English? What about other languages? What about tracking not just grammatical patterns, but the spread of ideas, the evolution of culture itself? Their method couldn't scale. Manual counting had hit its limit. They needed what seemed impossible: a way to read not hundreds of books, but millions, not over months, but in seconds. They needed a robot that could count every word ever written. Then, in 2006, they heard about a billionaire's audacious project. It had started 4 years earlier. Part 2. Google Books. In 2002, Google was thriving. The company's mission was to organize the world's information, and Larry Page knew that a lot of the world's information lived in books. But how much of it, and how hard would it be to digitize? Page and Marissa Mayer, then a Google product manager, decided to run an experiment. They grabbed a 300-page book and a metronome. Following the metronome's beat, they turned pages and timed themselves. It took 40 minutes. At that rate, digitizing a major university library would take 500 years. Digitizing all the world's books would take millennia. Most people would have stopped there. But Page wasn't thinking like most people. He was thinking like a 29-year-old billionaire. A person millennium is expensive, but it's not impossible to buy. So in 2004, Google publicly announced it would digitize every book ever written. The first step was creating a master list. Catalog information from hundreds of libraries merged into one database of 130 million books. Then came the scanning. Publishers sent new books to be cut apart and scanned at high speed. Libraries lent older books that had to be preserved, so Google hired teams of page-turners with cameras capturing each page. Every now and then, a thumb showed up in the image. Over the years, they turned billions of pages. By 2009, Google had digitized more than 30 million books, a collection that would take a human 20,000 years to read. By 2007, Lieberman and Michel, who had just finished their irregular verb project, heard about Google's massive digitization effort. They wanted access to this unprecedented dataset, but Google had a big problem: copyright. The company was already facing lawsuits. In 2005, the Authors Guild filed a class action suit alleging massive copyright infringement. Publishers joined in. By 2007, even Microsoft was piling on. Google wasn't going to just hand over the full text of 30 million books to 2 graduate students. But Lieberman and Michel didn't need the full text. They needed something simpler. They proposed creating what they called a shadow dataset, a way to obscure legally sensitive information while retaining the dataset's power. The shadow they proposed was elegant. For every word and phrase in the books, they would record only how frequently it appeared each year. No sentences, no context, no way to reconstruct the original texts, just numbers. The shadow had to protect copyright while remaining scientifically useful. And by recording only word frequencies without context, it did both. The shadow dataset seemed perfect, but convincing Google's legal department took more than logic. By summer 2009, Lieberman and Michel had one card left to play. Their work had caught the attention of Steven Pinker, psychologist, linguist, best-selling author, one of the most prominent scientists alive. Named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people on the planet. More importantly, when they asked him for help, he agreed to show up to a meeting. Dan Clancy, head of Google Books, was too busy for graduate students, but he would make time for Steven Pinker. They got 30 minutes. Pinker spent them explaining why this work mattered, why the shadow dataset was safe, why it should be released not just to researchers, but to the public. 30 minutes of Pinker's time bought them access to 500 billion words. After cleaning the data, what remained was pristine. 500 billion words spanning 5 centuries, more than 4% of all books ever published. In a darkened room at Harvard, they plugged in the hard drives. The computer booted. They typed their first query, evolution, the whir of spinning disks. A minute passed. Then, a chart appeared on the screen. Through a soft, undulating line, millions of voices spoke across centuries. The curve told a simple, powerful story that anyone could understand. The word evolution barely existed before Darwin. After 1859, it soared. They murmured their approval. Then came a pop, the cork. They had their telescope, now they needed to share it with the world. Part 3. Ngram Viewer. The name was technical, almost boring. An n-gram is just a sequence of words, like United States or drove. but what it could do was extraordinary. Type any word or phrase, and the Ngram viewer would show you how often it appeared in books over the last 5 centuries. A graph of cultural history, generated in seconds. On December 16, 2010, they made a coordinated launch. At 2 p.m., the journal Science published their research article. Simultaneously, Google made the Ngram viewer public online. The response was immediate and overwhelming. In the first 24 hours, the site got 3 million hits. Twitter lit up. Users called it addictive. The New York Times put it on the front page. People couldn't stop typing in queries. They compared pirates to ninjas. They tracked the rise of global warming. They searched for their own names. The tool was addictive because it answered questions people had always wondered about but could never test. Questions about language, about history, about how culture changes. Take collective memory. How long does it take society to forget a major event? They tracked mentions of Pearl Harbor year by year. The attack in 1941 created a massive spike. Everyone wrote about it, talked about it, remembered it. But then, slowly, predictably, the mentions declined. Society was forgetting. They could measure the half-life of collective memory, about 30 years. By the 1970s, Pearl Harbor had faded to a fraction of its peak. The same pattern appeared for every major event they tracked. The tool could also make censorship visible in ways that had never been possible before. They tracked the German artist Marc Chagall, a Jewish modernist whose work the Nazis considered degenerate art. In German books, his name appeared steadily through the early 1930s. Then, between 1936 and 1943, it almost vanished. After the war, the mentions slowly returned. The data didn't just document the suppression, it quantified it with brutal precision. Or consider innovation. They tracked inventions spreading through society. The telephone, the automobile, the radio, each left a characteristic signature. And they noticed something remarkable. Inventions were spreading faster and faster. Technologies from the early 1800s took 65 years to reach widespread cultural adoption. Technologies from around 1900 took only 26 years. The collective learning curve was compressing. Society was accelerating. Within months, millions of people around the world were using the Ngram viewer. Scholars were citing it in papers. Teachers were using it in classrooms. Journalists were using it to fact-check historical claims. It had become, almost overnight, a standard tool for looking at the past. Epilogue. 400 years ago, Galileo pointed a telescope at the sky and changed everything. What he saw contradicted the authorities of his time. They put him under house arrest, but his ideas couldn't be contained. After Galileo, Western thought split into 2 traditions: science, which studied the physical world through measurement, and the humanities, which studied human culture through careful reading and analysis. For centuries, these 2 approaches barely spoke to each other, but something is changing. The Ngram viewer sits at the intersection of both traditions. It's a tool built by mathematicians and engineers to help historians and linguists. It measures culture without reducing it. At universities around the world, the boundaries are dissolving. Science and humanities are becoming one discipline again. Galileo's telescope didn't just answer old questions, it made new questions possible. The cultural telescope does the same. 400 years after Galileo, we're learning again. The universe, including the human universe, is stranger and more wonderful than we imagined. This was Uncharted by Erez Aden and Jean-Baptiste Michel, first published in 2013. Thanks for listening.